The number one reason why you struggle to communicate with your team. Hi, I'm Kayla Swanson, and I'm your host of the Profitable Salon Owner Podcast. And hanging out with me today is Jason Everett. What's up, Jason?
Yo, excited to be hanging out, talking about this subject, man, because struggling to connect with your team, struggling to talk to your team and communicate, man, it's a big topic. Yeah. I think a lot of people feel it, and I'm hoping we can solve some of that today. I think that'd be awesome.
Kidding. I feel like it's an ever-evolving conversation to be having about communication in general, whether it's with your family, your team, your work. Like every time you get a new relationship, it's like figuring out a whole new way to communicate with somebody, because it's not just in what you say, but it's like how it's received to the other person.
Sure.
And so I'm excited to talk about this topic today, because in like trying to navigate your conversations with your team or conversations with your spouse or your kids or anything like that, there is a perspective to take in communication that I love. I love what we talk about. We just had Rock a Room a couple weeks ago, and we were talking a lot about communicating to a room. And Jason, share with us a little bit about Rock a Room, because I know people might not have the context of it.
Yeah. If you haven't been to Rock and Roll, I mean, basically, I've been a professional speaker now for, I don't know. I mean, I've been on stages for 30 years. Like, I'm old now, but like I've been on stages for 30 years. And I'm 43. I've been on stage, well, technically 31 years I've been on stage. I've been on stage since I was about 12 years old. I was actually just going through some VHS tapes. Do you know what a VHS tape is, Kayla?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
I used to watch movies on VHS.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Somebody asked about DVDs the other day, or they're like, is that old? I'm like, no, VHS is old. Anyway, so I was going through some old VHS tapes and like I'm trying to find video of me on stage at like 12 and 13 years old, because I think you guys appreciate that.
Definitely.
Somebody would at least find it entertaining. But anyway, I've been on stage for 30 years and as a professional speaker for over 16. And I just think that there's some incredible things that get in the way. And so we created this training called Rock a Room, primarily designed up front to certify our trainers to be on our stages. And then I had friends and people that were in other programs that were like, hey man, can I sneak into this training? Like, would you train me and my team? And so I always usually have a few other people from outside the industry that come to this thing and they just get blown away. Cause I'm like, look, whether you're in front of 10 people or in front of 10,000 people. And yes, I've been on stage in front of 10,000 people. Like, if you're in front of 10 or 10,000, there's some things you can do to drastically change the outcome to make sure that people hear you. And the number one thing that I'll just say, I'll give the answer early in the whole podcast. You don't have to wait till the last second of the podcast, because we're going to unpack it over the whole course of this, is you must take responsibility for not everything that you say, but how everybody in the audience heard it.
Wow. Man, that is so huge.
Right? It's like, whatever you say, if I assume responsibility for how every single person in the audience heard it, which is really difficult, to be honest, is like, in every conversation, there's what's said, what was meant, what was heard. And so like said, meant, heard, right? Like there's the words I said, there's what I meant, and there's what they actually heard. But if I say, everybody's going to do amazingly well and grow and whatever, and they all heard like, wah, 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 like I got to figure out how to break through the Charlie Brown speak. That's probably old comment too now. But anyway, break through the Charlie Brown speak and get it into something that people understand and they get a hold of and they can relate to. And like, this sounds funny, but like my job is to be a professional translator and take whatever I'm speaking about and translate it into the language that's appropriate for that group you're in front of. Like, you would never give a Harvard lecture to a group of kindergartners. Never. Right? Like, you wouldn't do that. And I'm not saying anybody's in Harvard or a kindergartner, but you got to know your audience. You got to know the context of what you're presenting. You got to know what they think about. You need to know, like, all of those things are hypercritical to you being a good presenter. And the more you understand that you have control over the way in which you're speaking to the who's that you're talking to will give you a very different outcome of whether you walk off stage and they go, oh my God, that was incredible. One of the best things we've ever heard. Thank you so much. We'd love to have you back. Like, that's what I want. Every time anybody gets off a stage, I want people to say, holy crap, that was the best thing we've ever heard. Thank you for being here, and then get invited back. And that's why I've been invited back to stages for the better part of 16 to 20 years now. Yeah. Over and over and over and over.
Now, if you're listening to this and you're like, well, I don't speak on stages, the same general, like, I don't want to say general, but the same conversation.
No, it's the same principles. If you're in a staff meeting of 5 people, you need to know what to do. Yeah. Because if you have staff meetings and your team's like, hey, can we do those once a quarter instead of once a month? Or can we do those like once a year? Like, that just means they're voting and saying they don't like your staff meetings. And they're saying, yeah. So like, if you're not having really good staff meetings, it means there's some work for you to do, which means you need to get better at rocking any size room. It could be a room of 10 or a room of 10,000. It doesn't matter. Exactly. But the same skills will translate with you to any size room that you're in. And that's why we tell people all the time, like, come and learn how to rock a room. It'll change your life, because it's just, there's so many different opportunities for you if you're willing to look for them.
Exactly. How many times, if you're listening to this, has somebody come up to you and be like, well, that's not what you said. And in your head, you're like, that is what I said, because I
Yeah.
love the what was said, what was
Yeah.
what was heard. And then you're
Right.
faced with that, like, well, then where do you go from there when somebody's saying you said something one way and you're like, that's not what I said.
Well,
and so
and what I would say is right on that, Kayla, just real quick, is that it's too late to correct it at that point that you're at. See, a lot of people are like, well, let me go back and fix it. I'm like, no, too late. You need to go back to the beginning of when it was communicated, because most upsets in relationships can be traced back to the original communication. So hear me on that, right? Is that most upsets in relationships can go back to the initial communication. And so what that means is that the breaking point or the issue or the problem was way back when you first communicated. And most people are trying to solve it at the end. So you got to go back and say, hey, what was your understanding? Right? What was heard? What was said? And it's funny this came up, but I was just talking to somebody about this yesterday, and I was having a conversation, and I mentioned like 5 things, but because the first thing that I said was negative, they didn't hear everything else after the negative comment.
totally.
Can you relate to that one?
Was it
Like,
a
I can relate
negative
to that
thing
one.
at the person? Like, were you saying something negative, like in regards to them? Because I know
No, it was just like in general, it was
something
kind of
negative in
negative. And it
general.
was like, okay, well, as soon as that negative thing happened, then it was like, I didn't hear anything else that happened.
because that energy transfers.
And that's the whole thing, right? Is like,
Mhm.
you have to be aware of like, all right, well, look, okay, it's like, how do we fix that problem? And I think it was just this really interesting thing that we tend to overlook as leaders of how we communicate. And so you got to ask yourself, like, how do I fix that communication? Maybe I need to bundle it a little bit differently. Maybe I need to move this forward. Maybe I need to work and say, hey, repeat back to me what you heard. Because one thing, if I like, and you probably heard me do this in team meetings, Kayla, is like, I'll say something. I'll be like, cool. So what did you understand what I just said?
Yeah.
And some people are like, I don't know what you just said. Okay. You weren't like, something happened and then you checked out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's okay. It happens. And I deserve to be better at that too.
And so so that's beautiful. So I hope you're excited to listen to this.
Thank you.
In some way.
I'm so glad I was told I was beautiful today. That was my goal. Can I be beautiful at some point?
Welcome.
I feel
Podcast
so
over.
pretty.
So if you're listening to that and you're relating, and maybe you have something in your mind of a conversation you need to have had, or experiences in the past where you've had a conversation that's either gone south, or what came out of that conversation went a different direction than you anticipated. Totally. I know sometimes you prepare so much and you script out, okay, I need to have this hard conversation, or even not a hard conversation, and you script out what you want to say.
Or you just obsess over it and rehearse in your head 1,000 times.
What are the 10 outcomes this could be, instead of being more connected to being present in that room. So Jason, let's dive into that. So what does it mean to start the process? Let's go to people who maybe have really, really struggled with communication or connecting with people in the room and being present with them. How do you start to work that muscle? Yeah,
well, I think the first thing is you got to define, like, what is communication? Like, I know this sounds really silly, but like, what's your definition of communication? Because I think a lot of people feel like communication is actually arguing or, solving disagreements or all kind of, like, if your definition of communication is like getting my point across to everybody or like telling people what to do, like if that's your, communication, like, let me break it down into its simplistic format. Something is sent, something is received. Like, that's communication. It was said, it was received, and then it was verified, received communication. Like, take it back to old, like, I'm not that old, but like, let's just talk about it. I'm familiar with that. I've seen it on TV. Maybe on a Charlie Brown episode. Anyway, so, right? Sorry, I'm just laughing at myself today for sounding extra old. Anyway, okay, so I'm using I don't even know what it's called. What is that thing called?
Morse code?
Morse code or whatever. Yeah, whatever the like old timey whatever
receiver is. Yeah.
Whatever things. You know what I'm talking about. Somebody on here is yelling at me right now. They're like, "It's called a blah blah." Anyway, whatever that thing is, the telegraph. Nice. I think it's telegraph. It's sent and it's received, and then they go, "Yep, verified." Like, that's why on walkie-talkies, when you use walkie-talkies, you're like, "Over." And like, received, over, copy. Like, you got it, copy. Like, you said, I heard you, it all came through, I'm good to go. Like, there's a sent, heard, and then a confirmation of receipt. Think about like email, text message. I sent the message, they're like, yep, it was received, unless you have that turned off on your phone, or whatever those things are, right? Like, we're verifying that communication. And so when you're working with people and you're trying to figure out how well am I communicating, if you just said, I want to make sure that whatever I communicate was received properly, then you assume responsibility for that communication. You go, I just want to make sure that everything that I send is received properly. That's communication in its basic form. But so many people change what they want communication to mean people do what I tell them to do. Or they'll be a little nicer. People do what I ask them to do because I've hired them, right? Yeah. Versus like what I would say is people do what they're supposed to do without me having to even ask them. Yeah. Oh, that's communication, right? It's like I've communicated. Like, what if I just communicate the goal and say, hey, I need you to accomplish this goal. Here's the reward for the goal. Now you go ahead and accomplish the goal. So making sure that communication was properly delivered off of whatever it was that you said is now the goal, right? Like you've got to figure out how do you remain in that place of, I want people to understand me. Like think of that, right? There's a lot of people are seeking to be understood. Like I want people to understand me. Have you heard that before? Like I really wish everybody would understand me. Would understand me.
Or
there's a phrase. I
feel so misunderstood. I hear that from people all the time.
And so like I feel misunderstood. I feel like I want people to understand. And so one of the things that I love from a phrase of like working with groups is seek first to understand before being understood. Seek first to understand before being understood. And so if you know what group you're in, like again, if I was framing this out and I didn't know who I was talking to, I knew I was talking to kindergartners, like I said, I would speak very differently. Like when I go to my kids' classrooms, even in my classroom for my 5th grader versus my 2nd grader, those are very different rooms to walk into. And the tone is different and the excitement level is different. And like you meet the teachers, you're like, oh, you must be a 2nd grade teacher. Because they're like, okay, everybody, let's go. And like I always tell people, I'm like, look, know who your audience is and know who you're talking to. Because if you talk to everybody, like, this is funny, but like as speakers, sometimes people regress to whatever they were teaching or speaking or training about. So if they were cheerleaders, they then talk to everybody like they're cheerleaders, like, all right, everybody, let's have fun today. And you're like, well, okay, like chill out. Like I'm an adult. Like this is not, we're not a football game. I'm not,
people get stuck there.
like, yeah. And I'm like, hey, we got to like learn how to communicate. So what's the business setting communication? What's the casual office communication? What are the levels of communication that if done properly can move you forward and help you really grasp the communication in a very strong way? And remember that feedback on your communication just doesn't come verbally. It also comes by people leaving your salon. Can I be too harsh and say that? Is like, yeah, I love punching in the face with that one. Is like, if people are not wanting to show up to your team meetings or they quit your salon and that's constantly happening, like that is communication. Yeah. And don't be mistaken that no communication, like this is my favorite. When I watch, like we're kind of talking speaker training here for a second, but like when I work with people who've been trained as speakers, they're like, oh, good, I've finished. And there are no questions. I have done my job. I have trained you on everything that I need to train you on. In fact, when there's no questions, that's actually negative because it means they're so overwhelmed, they have nothing to say.
Yep. They're like, I got to process this before I even ask the question.
I don't even know what you said. And I feel too shameful to raise my hand and whatever. So versus in my program, people are asking questions all the time, like observing and commenting and going and like asking. So I get to a thing and I'm like, hey, does anybody have any questions? It's not, did I regurgitate all the information that I have to you? Because it's not about information, it's about implementation. If my implementation is helping you understand it, then I'm doing my job.
Yeah. And I think even too, like when in just, having worked with you for the last 3 years, it's like also the stopping to make sure along the way. Are you guys understanding this? You're checking in and making sure that like at this point, it's like people sometimes show up to a stage or show up to a meeting and they're like, I have an agenda. I'm trying to get my point across. Then there's almost an expectation energy in the room that what I'm going to say is going to make sense to you. So shut up and listen. Instead of, hey, I am present with you in this conversation. Let me help lead you to the desired outcome. Let me see and check in and make sure that along the way you are actually processing them.
Ready to transform your business and improve your salon's profitability? With Lonza's 3-in-1 technology and intermixable shades, your hair color inventory is streamlined with limitless creativity behind the chair. Click the link below to unveil the secret to salon success.
Are you ready to increase your retention and revenue and convert website traffic to clients? Then you're ready for Maya. Maya creates better business relationships by pairing the right clients with the right beauty professionals. Use promo code HPSA for your first 2 months free. Visit joinmaya.com to get started.
We're Forest, born on the salon floor and built for and by hair and beauty professionals like you. Forest is your marketing, your reporting, your reputation management. You need one easy-to-use system that does it all. Forest. Together we grow.
I probably need a t-shirt that says, does that make sense? Because like I say, does that make sense like 1,000 times. I remember somebody new was like, Jason, in this conversation, you've said, does that make sense, like 75 times? And I was like, well, because I want to make sure it does.
Yeah. Because it matters to you.
I truly care. And they're like, well, if you were confident what you were saying, why wouldn't you just know that this landed? And I'm like, well, that's arrogance in my mind. It's arrogant to think that everything you said gets understood and never misunderstood.
Yeah.
And even the best communicators can be misunderstood. So let's get verification of that. And let's make sure, because remember, if communication at its base level is sending and receiving and verifying that the message was received, if that's basic communication, that's why I would say, does that make sense? Are you with me? Do you have any questions? What are your observations on that? And I think that's where people really fall short, is that verification. And that's when people, like you said earlier in the podcast, Kayla, you were like, that's why people say, hey, that's not what you said.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that's not really the words they said was one thing. And by the way, couple of things. There's words, there's tone, and then there's meaning.
Body language.
Yeah, and body
Nice.
meaning and body language. And I think when you look at that, there's the words that were said, and you and I have talked about this before. I'm like, hey, Kayla, good to see you today. Or like, hey, Kayla, good to see you today. Like, the tone makes a difference,
Totally.
right? And then
Or
same
if you
with
don't
body
look at me.
language. If I'm like, hey, Kayla, good to see you today, versus like, hey, Kayla, good to see you today. Like,
Right.
it does make a difference. And it's like, that's why I say intention, body language, or kind of what the rest of that recipe looks like. And all of a sudden, you know, have a very different level of communication, because it's only, this is what what was the study? There was a study done that said only 30% of what gets communicated is done using words, only 30%. So even though we're using words right now, actually, even as you're listening to the podcast, like you're perceiving my intention more than you're perceiving the words that I'm using. You're
Yeah.
trying to decide if I'm friendly or if I'm full of SHIT, or, you know what I mean? Like,
Thanks for not cussing.
yeah, no problem. Well, I don't know. Maybe there's some kids in the car for the podcast. I don't
knows?
know. I don't
But
know.
yeah, because if you could imagine if we were yelling this at each other, be like, you need to communicate like this and you need to do that. Like, and you're forcing something into it. I mean, there's a time and a place to be really direct, but if the tone and how you're presenting are just like, if you're worried about making payroll, if you're worried about, the stress of you owning a salon, you're coming to your salon meetings and you're drilling into your team, you guys need to accomplish this because you have fear in yourself,
Yeah.
and you're projecting that to them, even though like, but I'm not telling
Right,
them that. And I'm not
right.
saying those things. They're
Well,
still receiving that undertone.
Okay, so let's get weird on the podcast for a second.
Nice. Love this times. Nice. Ready.
And this also just came up recently. You telepathically communicate to people your little voices and your fears and frustrations. If you're thinking it, sometimes, not always, people will perceive what you've been thinking about them, not just what you say to them. And I think your body language sometimes gives it away. I mean, I don't know that, like, I'm not a telepathic, like, I am telling you something with my mind. The number is 11. Let's go. Like, I'm not saying that. I just think that, like, all I will say in my own experience is that somehow in a communication, if I'm thinking it even a little bit, there's some level of perception that the other person has that either something is off, or they might pick up on whatever that is through whatever cues in your physical body and representation. So again, I'm not claiming to be telepathic. I just want to be clear here. I just think that there is a version of telepathic communication that can still happen. And you might think I'm weird for saying that. So I'm sorry. Welcome to the Weird Show. This is the one podcast where we get awkward and weird. But I would just say, just keep that in mind, is that you get to look at that and say, is it quite possible that somehow telepathically I'm communicating something to somebody that I didn't mean to?
Yeah.
And that's like when somebody reacts really adversely or whatever to you, and you can kind of get the feeling from that person. Like, how do you describe that? There's no words to describe that. All it is some level of telepathic understanding. I'm not, again, we didn't get abducted by aliens. I don't think we have telepathic powers, none of that stuff. Take that off the podcast. But the rest of it is just saying there is some level of telepathic communication, I believe, that really goes on, not in a giant controlled way, but just in like that meaning gets communicated, which is why you have to be really, really clear for yourself before you communicate anything, because you will communicate things inappropriately.
And I think the number one thing, and at least in my experience of what I've witnessed in what is communicated, is dishonesty or not be encompassing the whole truth or holding back in some way or skirting around something, like you can feel the tension of like, you're not telling me something and I don't know how to describe it, but something's there. Well,
and the person who has the person with the less secrets is the most free. Right. And there was a study done. Actually, do I have the book back here? I do. I don't think you've ever seen me bust out this book, Kayla. Let's get it over. No. Okay.
Nice.
There's a book.
Orange one. Oh.
Tap Into Greatness by my friend. She passed away sadly a couple years ago of cancer. And I just pray for her. She's released a new book. Her brother, Blair Singer, who you know, Blair. This is
Blair's sister.
Blair's sister, Sarah Singer. She's an incredible human being who passed away and did incredible work for all kinds of companies.
Wow.
He helped her finish because she was working on another book before she passed away. He helped her finish the book and they just released her other book. So anyway, there's another book out. But the reason why I bring this up was Sarah's book, Tap Into Greatness. She talks about a study inside this book where they gave all these classroom teachers a group of students and they said, hey, this class is all of the like slackers, like low life people that like need to be whipped into shape. So please, like see what you can do to take care of them. And then they were given another class people and said, hey, these are the people that are exceptional. These are your extra bright students. And they're all like smarter than you probably think. And they were given these two classrooms and they did this experiment over and over again. And they would swap the classes, meaning that like, the kids they said were dumb told the other teacher they were smart and vice versa.
Wow.
And what they found is the noticeable difference in the experiment was not the kids, but the teacher's perception of the children.
Wow.
And so every time that the teacher perceived they were working with a class of gifted students, they would give extra license to bad behavior. Like they'd be like, well, that's just because they're gifted. Like that's why they're acting out is they're extremely intelligent. They know what's going on. So I'll just work with them a little bit more and like we'll help to mature that gift that's inside of them and help them figure it out. And those students always did well when they told them they were exceptional. And the students who were told were the like, trash of the school, they always did very poorly in all those cases and all the examples. And so she talks about the power of intention, but the word 10 being in the middle of intention, T-E-N, like the number 10. Okay. So she says in this book, what I want you to do is I want you to imagine every single student with a 10 over their head in every classroom, that they all have a 10 over their head. And your job is to tap into their greatness. And I'm actually working on another book with Blair right now called Uncovering Greatness in this exact same vein from the exact same type of piece here is how do you, and I'm sorry, I just said it's uncovering greatness. It's not uncovering greatness. It's uncovering genius. Sorry, I got confused.
Nice.
I read greatness.
Nice.
You were like, what the hell?
Yeah.
Speaking of said, meant heard. But yeah, tapping into greatness. And we're working on a book called Uncovering Genius. And I just meant it's in the same concept of like, if you think that they're all geniuses, you can help them reveal that they actually are. If you think they're all idiots, then they will all feel like they're idiots. And that's when you're teaching a class, if you start getting in that mode, we're like, God, these people are all just a bunch of morons. And they, blah, 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 or like, oh, my staff is just a bunch of like, garbage can eating, blah, blah, blah. And they're never going to get anywhere and yada, yada, yada. Like that was my big insult without cussing.
I love that.
Garbage can eaters. Thanks. But the idea is that they're in a position where they rise to the level of expectations you give them. And if you believe they're geniuses, they will prove it to you. And if you believe they're morons, they will prove it to you.
Yeah, man. It's funny because this is like really resonating with me as well. That's why I'm like processing.
Read the book, steal it from my office. You can
deal. Done. Nice. You heard it here. I'm stealing his book.
With permission.
With permission. It's so crazy to me how, the impact that can have when you have your own underlying impression. Like, don't judge a book by its cover. You hear that phrase a lot as well. And so people come in and like, they make one mistake or they make a second mistake. And sometimes there's people have their strengths and weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And then people like we build on and hold accountable people to their behavior. And we don't ever let that go or reframe. And so we're taking in all this information of things that have happened in the past. And then like in relationships, like you said, it's like you try to deal when you need to go back to the root in the beginning, because now you have like a year or so of a perception of somebody based off of something that happened a year ago. And then you pull that forward instead of dealing with what really happened and getting to the bottom of that conversation.
Well, and so take this in the salon space is like, maybe I had a gal who worked with me 15 years ago. she was in a spot in her life where she was really low, like 20 years ago. And somebody helped her out with some money and they helped her run the salon and whatever. It was a stylist that worked there. And he totally took care of her and like helped her get through the hardest time in her entire life. Wow. And here we are, fast forward 20 years forward. And he works there. And every week I'm having this conversation. I'm like, what's going on? She goes, God, this guy, I'll just call him Tim. I don't know what his name was. Tim or Timothy. Timothy is just, he's rude to everybody. He scares off the new employees. And I'm like, why are you keeping this guy on your team? And she's like, he's mean to me. He like borderline is like abusive to stylists and like he needs to go. And I was like, why are you not letting him go? And she goes, well, like he saved my life like 20 years ago. Oh. Yeah. So it goes the other way too, right? Totally. Is like, you got to say like, how do I establish those boundaries and say like, how do I use this communication? Because I think the most important part, and the reason why I brought up that story was not like, how do you heartlessly let this person go? But you've got to say, what does the current evidence that I have suggest? What is the current evidence and what are we dealing with today? Where are we at? And can I change it? Does it have the availability to change? Or am I stuck in an old pattern, belief system, or issue that is not going anywhere? Like, am I holding that against them or am I giving them extra credit when they should or should not deserve it?
Ooh, that brings me another question that I have. And I think it'd be really cool if you are listening to this and have the same question of like, okay, so in that example, how do you know when communication is working with somebody or it's not working or it's somebody who you can't like, because not everybody can easily communicate with people. Yes, please. What is the answer?
There's only two types of relationships. There's ones you work on and ones you don't. Nice. And if you're talking about the person more than you're talking to the person, the relationship's not working.
Ooh. Oh, man. I feel like this podcast is directly for me.
But do you know what I'm saying? Like, totally. Like, think about it. Even at work, if you're like, if you're talking about that person all the time, you're like, this person, this, and this person, this, and this person, this, and this person, this, and you're talking about the third person all the time, there's something broken in that relationship. So that's why they say like, don't talk about your spouse to other people, because if you are, you're creating even more distance in that relationship. So in our code of honor, it says deal direct. The reason why it says deal direct is every minute you spend talking to somebody else about that relationship is not working on that relationship with that person. Whoa. Right.
And you commiserate and then you're talking to other people and then those people are feeding
into it. Look for validation and they're like, oh yeah, he did that to me too. She did that to me too. Yeah. I think you're right. And like all of a sudden you're having all these different conversations and like that almost like, I'm just being really honest, that almost wrecked our entire organization about 2 years ago. Almost 2 years ago, I literally had a conversation and somebody was telling me, if you don't do this, the whole team's going to quit and all this stuff was going on. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I haven't heard any of these things. And every time I would ask the team, I'm like, hey, is this going on? They're like, no. None of that stuff's going on. And what I realized is because they felt they were talking to somebody else about it, they felt it was getting handled. But then the person they needed to talk to was me. So we had a conversation and they voiced their concerns. And I'm like, I can handle that. No problem. What do you want me to do? This? Done. Anything else? And they were like, why was that so easy? Like, because you talk to the person. And this is what it says. Our code of honor says, go direct to the person who's able to do something about it. Not the other friend who can talk to the other friend. That's not the same. Right. The only one who can change it is me or whoever that person is. At the end of the day, that person can do something about it. Anybody you're talking to that's not them can do actually nothing to do anything about it. Yeah. They pretend like they have some power and they don't. And so we had to have that restorative conversation. It moved everything forward. And at the end of the day, I now notice when we triangulate conversations, and by the way, hoping you're having some good PTSD for your own salon here, is realizing like where you have these conversations and you're like, oh shoot, that's what I did last week to that employee or this employee. Is like I was having conversations about them and I was not talking to them. And so the general rule is if you talk about them more than twice, you need to have a meeting with them. Yeah. Like once is probably like enough. But if you're one or two times, like, man, I just realized like if I was like, man, Kayla, blah, 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 blah. I'm talking to somebody else. Kayla, yada, yada, yada. And then the second time I'm like, well, I'm really talking to Kayla about whatever. I'm like, oh, shoot, I just talked about her twice. That should be my cue to be like, hey, Kayla, can I talk to you for a minute? Yeah. Because it just means there's something that I haven't addressed with you and it's coming up and it's bothering me and I'm holding it. I'm holding it back from you and I need to fix that.
Exactly. And if the salon, whether you're in your mind, the person that you're thinking of the person you need to have a conversation with, or in that comes up, it's like, if you care about the development of that relationship, like Jason said, you're either working it's either working or you're not working on it.
Yeah.
And so
relationship you work on, relationship you don't. That's it.
Exactly. Especially with your team. If it's not a relationship that you want to continue to work on, then reevaluate why they're in your salon in the first place. Because if you can't have an open conversation with somebody and you don't have a way to navigate that in your mind, or you're not willing to.
Another way to say that, if you've quit on them, you've already fired them.
Ooh. Oh, man.
If you've quit on them, you've already fired them. So like, in this organization of our company, and I'm aware of that, is if I stop helping you, like, know where we're going. If I'm like, no, Kayla, everything's cool. And I don't mean like, I'm just telling you everything's cool because everything is actually cool. But if you're asking for feedback and I'm like, no, it's fine. It's good. Okay. All right. Yep. No. Yep. Yeah. It's good. Good. Like, I would start to get really nervous because like I give the most feedback and critique to the people that I know have more in them.
Yeah.
Right. Is like, think about this. What coach in their right mind doesn't coach their star player? No. You coach your star player even more. I was watching this video. This was such a good thing. I was watching this video the other day, and it was like these kids, and it was a little video that just said, it was talking about, they penalized him for being good or something. And it was all these kids running across a football field. These little kids, we're talking like 5-year-olds. They're all running across the field, maybe 8, whatever. They're running across the field. And one kid has to bear crawl for the first like 25 yards. And he's bear crawling, and all the other kids are running at full speed. And they have to go down the field and then come back. So the first guy bear crawls for the first quarter, and the other kids are almost to the halfway across. They're turning around. And then the kid who's bear crawling gets up, makes it all the way across, all the way back, and still beats them to the other line.
Whoa.
Because he was that fast. And it was like penalized for being good or something like that. And in the comments, it was really fascinating because people were like, I don't know why people think this is like you're penalized for being good. A good coach will make the pressure just as hard for every player, not make the star player always feel like a star.
Yeah. Wow.
So if you're getting all that feedback, you're like, why am I getting all this feedback? Celebrate the feedback. It might mean that you've got more to give and somebody sees potential in you that you haven't seen. And as a leader, you should be looking at your star players and being like, hey, I want to help you get even better. Like, if you want that, I'm down to help you get there. And like, I will never let up on somebody, even if they're talented. In fact, I will be harder on you if you're talented because you have more to give than everybody else. I don't want you to get away with giving me just the half-ass effort that somebody else did.
And as somebody who experienced that firsthand, it's true. It's like being challenged and you have to work through your own emotions through it. Like, I've had to like navigate being in that position, but realizing the benefit of like how much I've grown in the last 3 years by being surrounded by people who do challenge me and who like give me, here's an extra bar to race to, bigger than I even think of myself.
Yeah. Leave when you're no longer challenged. And I don't mean that, to you personally, I am saying that, but I'm also saying like, if you're not being challenged, you're not growing, then it means you're in the wrong spot. Right. And I think so many people are like, where's the easy job? What's the job I can make the most amount of money and have the easiest life? I'm like, well, that's okay. Just like, that's called the government, and feel free to work there and they'll never fire you. And it'll be a super easy job and you'll hate every day of your life because you're not being challenged. No offense to government employees, but I know none of them are listening to this call, right? It's like, they're not listening to us right now, Kayla, because everybody on this call is like, no, I wanted something hard. Like, you did something ridiculously hard. You opened a salon, for crying out loud. You asked for hard things. And if you have a team of 1 or a team of 100, you're doing something harder every day. And if you've grown that into what it is today, you know that doing the harder thing and managing more relationships. And by the way, every time you grow in communication, every 7 people requires a full level up in your ability to communicate. Every 7 people. So when you have a team of 7, 1 layer of communication. Team of 14, you have to be a totally different communicator.
Completely.
Team of 28, you've already evolved 4 times now. I'm not going to do the math on the rest of it, but you get my point, right? Is like, if you have 70 people on the team, now you have 10 times the communication skills you needed when you had 7. So depending on the size of your team, you need to elevate as a communicator, which means you need to be listening to things like this, getting help, getting support, getting involved with peer groups, whatever you need to do to help you move, because that'll make the difference. Helpful?
Huge. Helpful. So
did that make sense, Kayla?
Yes.
Is this helpful?
Yes,
Has this been good for you? By the way, do me a
fully
favor.
understand.
Comment in the chat if you thought this was helpful. Send me a DM somewhere and say, Jason, I friggin' love this podcast. I don't get enough of those. So maybe my podcasts are not cool when I'm on, Kayla. I don't know, but But I hope that's not the case.
Please give us feedback. We would love your feedback. Please
We
reach
always
out
love
to
the
us
feedback.
at any time. I want to make one more connection, then I want to answer the original question that we asked is if you want to be better at giving feedback to your team and doing it well, then surround yourself with people that you can receive feedback from.
Totally.
Because people who are able to give the right people, not people who are going to fill you and like just support you and tell you all the good things, but people who can challenge you, ask the questions that make you think, that won't just always tell you that you're right. You need people that surround you with love to be able to tell you when you maybe aren't on the right track, which is a huge thing. Okay, so when we started this podcast, we said the number one reason why you can't communicate with your team, and I want to make sure we wrap up with one last thing of why you are struggling to communicate with your team, Jason.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it's everything we talked about, and it's because you need to continue to evolve as a communicator. Your number one job as a business owner is to communicate with clients, guests, staff, everybody, and take care of them and communicate at a higher level than anybody else on the planet. And if you're a business owner, that is your obligation, is to learn to be the best communicator on the planet and do whatever you can to level yourself up. So I think that the struggle is in your inability to learn how to be a better communicator.
Yeah. And if you think that's too hard, that's too much of a mountain to climb, I want to encourage you that it's just a process of life that'll bring you so much freedom and peace that it's like, it may seem like a big load and a lot to learn, but as you get on that ball rolling and start pursuing being a better communicator, it gets easier, it gets better, and you'll have more success.
Got it. Rock and roll.
Amazing. Thank you for joining us on today's Profitable Salon Owner Podcast, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Jason, for hanging out with me.
No problem. Anytime.
All right. See you next time, guys.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Profitable Salon Owner Podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave us a review, and check us out at profitablesalon.com for more episodes, content, and to help you turn your salon into the business you've always dreamt of.